The richest pervert in Seoul thought he owned the hallway until the elevator opened and the city's most dangerous mafia boss stepped out. Most men in this hotel would have looked away, but Kang Tae-hyun isn't most men. Stay with me until the end, because you're about to see the exact moment a monster decided to become a guardian, and the terrifying price this harasser had to pay for thinking he was the most dangerous man in the room. The Grand Imperial Hotel was less a building and more a cathedral of quiet wealth, a place where the air itself smelled of sandalwood, expensive perfume, and the kind of secrets that only the elite could afford to keep. Every surface was a testament to excess, from the hand-polished marble floors that mirrored the shimmering crystal chandeliers above to the gold leaf molding that traced the edges of the ceiling like a gilded cage. Here the light didn't just illuminate, it glowed with a soft, amber hue designed to make every guest look younger, richer, and more innocent than they truly were. It was a fortress of luxury where the outside world's grime was never permitted to enter, and the only rule was that the machinery of the hotel must remain entirely invisible. At the heart of that invisible machinery was Han Soo-ah. To the guests who swept past her in silk dresses and bespoke suits, she was little more than a ghost in a black and white uniform, a flickering shadow that existed only to replace the used towels, straighten the Egyptian cotton sheets, and vanish before she could be noticed. She had mastered the art of the lowered gaze, moving through the corridors with a silent, practiced grace that ensured her presence never disrupted the carefully curated atmosphere of the Grand Imperial. In this temple of vanity, Soo-ah was a non-entity, a living tool meant to facilitate the comfort of others, while her own dreams and fears were relegated to the cramped, windowless staff locker rooms in the basement. Her existence was defined by the golden cage of her surroundings. She was surrounded by breathtaking beauty every day, yet she was forbidden from truly touching it. She polished the silver she would never eat from and scrubbed the tubs she would never bathe in, always aware that one wrong word or a single misplaced glance could shatter the illusion of her invisibility and cost her the meager paycheck that kept her family afloat. To the wealthy regulars who frequented the hotel, she wasn't a young woman with a story or a soul. She was a piece of the furniture, as silent and disposable as the complimentary stationery on the mahogany desks. In the hushed, high-stakes world of the Grand Imperial, Soo-ah's greatest skill was her ability to disappear in plain sight, never realizing that in a place where everyone is watching their own reflection, being a ghost is the most dangerous thing you can be. The heavy, floral scent of the lobby never reached the North Wing's secondary corridor. Here the air was stagnant, weighted by the scent of floor wax and the impending storm of a man's ego. Choi Min-seok didn't walk into the hallway, he prowled it, his grey suit sharp enough to cut, yet his movements lacked the refinement of the true elite. He was a man who used his wealth like a blunt instrument, and today his target was the girl who had spent months trying to remain a ghost. Han Soo-ah was cornered between a heavy service cart and the cold, unyielding marble of the wall, the low hum of the hotel's vents mocking her frantic heartbeat. Min-seok stepped into her personal space, his shadow stretching long and distorted under the dim recessed lighting. He reached out, his fingers tracing the edge of her white collar with a familiarity that made her skin crawl. "You've been avoiding me, Soo-ah," he murmured, his voice thick with a nauseating mix of wine and entitlement. "That's a very dangerous game for someone whose signature is on a minimum wage contract." Soo-ah kept her eyes fixed on his silk tie, her hands balled into tight fists at her sides. "I have rooms to finish, Mr. Choi. Please let me pass." The request only fueled him. He leaned in closer, his hand moving from her collar to her shoulder, gripping the fabric until she heard the faint, terrifying groan of the seams. "You don't seem to understand the hierarchy here," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "I pay for the view, the bed, and the silence. If I decide I want the girl who makes the bed, who is going to stop me, your manager, he's already accepted my gift for the month. One phone call from me, and you're not just fired, you're blacklisted from every luxury establishment in Seoul." The threat hung in the air, cold and jagged, threatening not just her livelihood, but her entire existence. Min-seok saw the flicker of terror in her eyes and smiled, a jagged, predatory thing. He moved to bridge the final inch of distance, his other hand reaching for her waist, his intent turning from verbal intimidation to physical claim. The hallway felt like it was shrinking, the gold-leafed walls closing in like the bars of a cell, leaving Suar with nowhere to run and no breath left to scream. The suffocating tension of the hallway was suddenly pierced by a sharp, melodic ping, the sound of the elevator reaching the floor. It was a mundane noise, yet in the vacuum of Suar's terror, it sounded like a crack of thunder. Choi Min-seok didn't pull away immediately. He kept his hand clamped firmly on Suar's arm, his head turning with a look of annoyed arrogance toward the opening doors. He expected a terrified bellboy or another invisible staff member who would scurry away at the sight of him. He did not expect the man who stepped out. Kang Tae-hyun emerged from the lift not as a guest, but as a deliberate force of nature. He was a pillar of midnight in a world of muted grays, clad in a black suit so perfectly tailored it looked like armor. The silk of his shirt was unbuttoned just enough to reveal the edge of a dark, intricate tattoo that crawled up the side of his neck, a dragon's tail lost in the shadow of his jawline. It was a mark of a life lived in the dark, a visual warning that stopped the breath in Min-seok's throat. Tae-hyun didn't rush. He stepped into the hallway with a measured, predatory gait, his Italian leather shoes striking the marble with the finality of a gavel. The air in the corridor didn't just cool, it turned glacial. His eyes, dark and unreadable, bypassed the wealthy harasser entirely, locking instead on Suar's trembling form and the white-knuckled grip Min-seok held on her torn sleeve. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. Tae-hyun stopped 6 feet away, his presence expanding until he seemed to occupy every inch of the gilded cage. He didn't need to speak to assert dominance. His authority radiated from him like heat from a furnace. Min-seok, who had just been boasting about his power, suddenly looked small, a gaudy imitation of a man standing in the shadow of the real thing. The balance of the hallway had flipped in a single heartbeat, and for the first time, the predator realized he had become the prey. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the hallway was the frantic, shallow breathing of Choi Min-seok. Kang Tae-hyun stood perfectly still, his hands relaxed at his sides, yet the sheer gravity of his presence seemed to pull the light toward him. He didn't look like a man about to start a fight. He looked like a man who had already won it decades ago. "You were saying something about a payroll," Tae-hyun finally spoke. His voice wasn't a shout, it was a low, velvet rasp that felt like a blade pressed against a jugular. The volume was so controlled that Min-seok had to lean in slightly to hear, an instinctive movement that placed him even further into the wolf's reach. "You seem to believe that the gold on these walls belongs to you because you've paid for a room." Min-seok's grip on Suar's arm faltered, his fingers twitching. He tried to summon his previous bravado, but it came out as a brittle, high-pitched stammer. "You don't know who I am, my family's holdings." "I know exactly what your family holds," Tae-hyun interrupted, his eyes shifting to the hand still touching Suar's torn uniform. The temperature in the corridor seemed to drop another 10 degrees, and I know how quickly those holdings would vanish if the people I work with decided they no longer liked the smell of your name. You speak of buying silence as if it's a commodity, but silence is earned through fear, not bank transfers. Tae-hyun took a single step forward. It was a small movement, but Min-seok recoiled as if he'd been struck. The Mafia boss finally looked him in the eye, a dark, bottomless stare that reflected nothing but the harasser's own growing insignificance. "A man who preys on the help isn't a predator, Min-seok. He's a scavenger, and scavengers don't survive very long in my hallways." The realization hit Min-seok with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just another wealthy guest or a hotel executive. This was the man the legends warned about, the shadow that moved the money that moved the world. The gray suit that had felt like armor moments ago now felt like a shroud. Min-seok's hand dropped from Suar's arm as if the fabric had turned to white-hot iron. He was no longer the master of the golden cage. He was a rabbit that had wandered into the den of a starving wolf, and the only thing keeping him alive was the boss's current lack of interest in making a mess on the marble. "Apologize," Tae-hyun whispered, the word carrying the weight of an executioner's axe. "And then run, before I decide that your family's holdings are worth more to me as a memory than a reality." The heavy silence that followed Min-seok's retreat was thick with the scent of ozone and expensive cologne. Han Suar remained pressed against the marble wall, her legs finally giving out as the adrenaline of the confrontation ebbed away. She began to slide toward the floor, her hands clutching the shredded remains of her sleeve, but she never hit the cold stone. Instead, she felt the firm, steadying grip of Kang Tae-hyun. As he reached out to catch her, Soo-ah instinctively clung to the lapels of his black suit, her fingers digging into the high-quality fabric. For a moment, the world narrowed down to the heat radiating from him and the rhythmic thrum of a heartbeat that was far steadier than her own. She was trembling, not just from the cold of the hallway, but from the sheer magnitude of the man holding her. Tae-hyun stood frozen. He was a man who lived by the rule that connection is a liability, yet the feeling of this small, frightened woman seeking sanctuary in his arms sparked a sudden, violent protective instinct. In the dead center of his heart, a place he had spent years turning into a fortress of professional detachment, something shifted. It wasn't just pity, it was a realization that he was capable of being more than a shadow in a custom-tailored suit. "You're safe," he murmured, his voice losing its serrated edge. He didn't pull away. Instead, he allowed her to anchor herself to him, his hand resting cautiously on her back. In that brief moment of physical contact, the ghost boss of the Korean underworld found a flicker of the humanity he thought he had buried long ago. He looked down at her, a maid who had been invisible to everyone else, and realized that from this moment on, she was the only person in the city whose safety truly mattered to him. The private elevator ascended in a silence so absolute it felt heavy, eventually opening directly into the apex of the Grand Imperial, Tae-hyun's penthouse. As he guided Soo-ah inside, the sheer scale of his world became a cold, staggering reality. It was a space of brutalist elegance, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the neon veins of Seoul, minimalist furniture crafted from steel and obsidian, and a pervasive chill that the high-end climate control couldn't quite reach. This was not a home, it was a fortress, a high-altitude lookout for a man who trusted no one. The walls were devoid of photographs, color, or personal mementos, replaced instead by flickering security monitors and the long, sharp shadow of Tae-hyun's own silhouette cast against the city lights. To Soo-ah, still draped in his heavy charcoal blazer, the penthouse felt like an extension of the man himself, vast, imposing, and profoundly lonely. Tae-hyun gestured toward a deep velvet sofa, perhaps the only soft object in the entire suite. As she sat, looking fragile and small against the backdrop of his sprawling empire, the contrast was jarring. Her presence, marked by a stray strand of hair and the faint scent of the hotel's industrial laundry soap, was a sudden intrusion of humanity into a life built on professional detachment and calculated violence. He stood by the window, his back to her, watching the pulse of the city he supposedly ruled. He had spent years ensuring no one could get close enough to hurt him, yet here was a woman who had breached his perimeter without even trying. She didn't fit into the steel and glass, yet as her reflection appeared in the window beside his own, the sharp edges of his world seemed to soften. He realized then that he didn't just want to protect her from the predators in the hallway. He wanted to see if her light could survive the cold of his shadow, and more surprisingly, if his shadow could be warmed by light. The stillness of the penthouse was shattered by the persistent buzz of the intercom, a sound that usually signaled a courier of bad news. Below, in the lobby of the Grand Imperial, Chairman Choi arrived not with a plea for mercy, but with a briefcase and a sense of misplaced arrogance. He was a man who believed that every soul had a price tag, and that his son's mistake in the hallway could be settled like a late utility bill. When the chairman was permitted entry, he didn't look at Soo-ah. He didn't even acknowledge the woman whose life his son had nearly derailed. Instead, he walked toward Tae-hyun's desk and laid down a thick, heavy envelope. "A misunderstanding between young people shouldn't ruin a business relationship, Boss Kang," the chairman said, his voice oily with false camaraderie. "There is enough in there to buy the girl's silence and a new car for your trouble. Let's consider the matter closed." Tae-hyun didn't look at the money. He didn't even blink. He simply leaned forward into the light, the dragon tattoo on his neck appearing to writhe as his jaw tightened. "You think you're paying for my trouble?" Tae-hyun's voice was a whisper that carried the force of a landslide. "You aren't paying for me. You're trying to buy back the hand your son used to touch her, and the price for that is much higher than paper." The chairman's smile faltered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he realized his bribe had been interpreted as a declaration of war. Taehyun didn't wait for a response. He picked up his phone and dialed a number that only rang in the dark corners of the financial district. "Start the audit," he commanded. "Every shell company, every offshore account, every bribe the Choi family has paid in the last decade. I want them gutted by sunrise. If they want to talk about business relationships, let's show them exactly how I do business." As the chairman was forcibly escorted out by two silent, black-suited guards, the gravity of the situation finally set in. Taehyun wasn't just defending a maid, he was dismantling a dynasty. He turned back to Suar, his eyes still burning with the cold fire of retribution, but his hands, the hands that could destroy a billion-dollar empire with a single call, carefully adjusted the blazer around her shoulders. The Mafia-style audit had begun, and before the sun rose over Seoul, the Choi family would realize that some things in this world are truly priceless. The boardroom of the Choi Corporation was a palace of glass and arrogance, but at 2:00 a.m., it felt more like a tomb. Chairman Choi and his son Min Seok sat at the head of a mahogany table that had seen billion-dollar mergers, but tonight, the only thing being liquidated was their dignity. Kang Taehyun sat opposite them, framed by the skeletal silhouettes of the city's cranes through the window. He didn't have a weapon drawn, he didn't need one. His presence alone had drained the color from the room. On the table lay a single tablet, its screen glowing with the results of the Mafia-style audit Taehyun had unleashed. "Your family's legacy is built on a foundation of sand," Taehyun said, his voice a low, lethal hum that seemed to vibrate the very glass of the table. "I've spent the last 4 hours buying your debt, leaning on your creditors, and leaking your offshore tax evasions to the authorities. By the time the markets open, the name Choi will be synonymous with bankruptcy and scandal." Min Seok tried to stand, his face twisted in a mask of fading entitlement. "You can't do this over a maid, she's nothing." Taehyun's eyes didn't flicker. He simply tapped a key on the tablet, playing a grainy, high-definition security loop of the hallway, the moment Suar's uniform tore, the moment her tear hit the marble. "That tear," Taehyun whispered, "cost you everything you own. You thought your status gave you the right to break people. I'm here to show you that there is always a bigger monster in the dark." He pushed a single document across the table, a total relinquishment of the family's shares and a signed confession of Min Seok's assault. There was no negotiation. Taehyun had dismantled their lives with surgical precision, using the very systems of power they thought they controlled. As the chairman's hand shook while reaching for the pen, he realized the terrifying truth. Taehyun hadn't fired a single bullet because death would have been too merciful. He wanted them to live long enough to see what it felt like to be invisible, disposable, and utterly broken, just like the ghosts they had stepped on to reach the top. 6 months had passed, and the north wing of the Grand Imperial remained a sanctuary of absolute gilded silence. The golden cage had not changed its appearance, but its soul had been completely replaced. The air no longer carried the heavy scent of hidden sins or the stagnant weight of fear. Instead, it was light, fresh, and perpetually scented with the jasmine and lilies that arrived daily from the city's finest florists. Han Suar no longer wore the black and white uniform that had made her a ghost. Now she moved through the hotel with a quiet, confident grace, dressed in soft silks that mirrored the warmth in her eyes. She wasn't just a guest, and she wasn't staff. She was the heartbeat of the hotel. To the world, she was the director of the hotel's new charitable foundation. But to the men in black suits who bowed as she passed, she was something far more significant, the only person Kang Taehyun truly listened to. The mafia boss had not become a soft man, but he had become a purposeful one. He still ruled with a shadow that stretched across the city, yet that shadow now acted as a shield rather than a shroud. The hallway where Suar had once been cornered was now the most guarded corridor in Seoul. No one dared to raise their voice, let alone their hand, within these walls. The new rules were unwritten but absolute. Respect was not bought, it was the entry fee. In the evenings, Taehyun could often be found in the penthouse, the cold steel and obsidian of his world softened by the presence of Suar's books and the flowers she insisted on planting in the terrace garden. As they stood together overlooking the neon sprawl of the city, the silence between them was no longer the heavy, lonely void of a fortress. It was the peaceful quiet of a man who had finally found a reason to step out of the dark, and a woman who no longer had to hide in it. The hallway was finally silent, the predators were gone, and for the first time in both their lives, they were truly safe.